Jimmy and Emma had what seemed to be a picture-perfect life in their small Texas town. Jimmy, 25, was an avid hunter and outdoorsman, while 24-year-old Emma worked at a boutique in town. They had been married for 2 years, and their love for each other had been the talk of their close-knit community. Everyone thought they were the perfect couple, destined for a lifetime of happiness. Recently, Emma had given birth to their first child, a beautiful baby girl named Lily. The arrival of their daughter brought them immense joy and added another layer to their already strong bond. Jimmy doted on Emma and Lily, often coming home from his job at the local hardware store with small gifts and treats. Despite their modest means, they were happy. However, Jimmy began to notice subtle changes in Emma's behavior not long after Lily was born. She seemed more distant, often lost in thought, and her phone was always close by. She had also started working late at the boutique, claiming that her boss needed extra help with inventory and organizing. Jimmy tried to brush off his concerns, but a nagging feeling in the back of his mind kept him on edge. One evening, while Emma was in the shower, Jimmy took a deep breath and decided to check her phone. It was locked, but he knew her well enough to guess the password: Lily's birth date. His hands were shaking as he entered the numbers, but the screen did not unlock. He tried a few more combinations, but nothing worked. It was unusual for Emma to change her password without telling him, and his suspicions grew. Jimmy decided not to confront her just yet. Instead, he began to pay closer attention to her actions. He noticed that she was receiving more late-night texts and calls, often stepping outside to take them. Her explanations were always the same work-related issues that needed immediate attention. But something about her tone and body language told him otherwise. One Saturday afternoon, Jimmy decided to take Lily for a walk in the park to give Emma some time to herself. While pushing the stroller, he bumped into an old friend, Mike, who worked as a bartender at a popular local spot. They chatted for a bit, and Jimmy casually mentioned Emma's late nights at work. Mike's expression changed, and he hesitated before speaking. "Jimmy, I don't want to cause any trouble, but I've seen Emma at the bar a few times lately. She was with some guy I didn't recognize. They seemed pretty close." Jimmy's heart sank. He thanked Mike for the information and tried to keep his composure for Lily's sake. As he continued their walk, his mind raced with thoughts of betrayal and confusion. Who was this man? And why was Emma spending time with him? Determined to find out the truth, Jimmy began to subtly gather information. He checked Emma's social media profiles for any clues but found nothing out of the ordinary. Then he remembered something Emma had said in passing about her new boss, a young, up-and-coming actor named Jake, who had recently moved to their town to escape the Hollywood spotlight for a while. Could Jake be the man Emma was seeing? The thought made Jimmy's blood boil. He decided to dig deeper into Jake's background and discovered that Jake was indeed well known in Hollywood circles, having starred in a few successful movies. What would a guy like Jake want with Emma? Jimmy's hunting skills came into play as he started to track Emma's movements without her knowledge. He followed her one evening when she said she had to work late again. His heart pounded as he saw her drive to a secluded restaurant on the outskirts of town. From a distance, he watched as she met Jake, their interactions far from professional. He could not hear their conversation, but the body language spoke volumes. They laughed, touched hands, and looked at each other in a way that made Jimmy's stomach turn. It was clear that their relationship was more than just work-related. Jimmy drove home in a daze, his mind racing with anger and sadness. He could not believe Emma would do this to him and Lily. He needed to confront her, but he wanted to be sure he had all the facts before he did. The pain of betrayal was sharp, but he knew he had to be strong for his daughter. Over the next few days, Jimmy continued his covert surveillance, confirming his worst fears. Emma and Jake were having an affair. The realization hit him hard, but he kept his emotions in check. He could not afford to lose control now. One night, while Emma was asleep, Jimmy sat in the living room, staring at the wedding photo on the mantel. He knew he had to confront her, but he wanted to do it in a way that would not escalate the situation further. He needed a plan, a way to protect himself and Lily from the fallout that was sure to come. The next morning, Jimmy made a decision. He would gather as much evidence as possible and confront Emma when the time was right. He would not let this betrayal destroy his life or his daughter's future. He would fight for what was his, using the skills and determination that had always been his greatest strengths. Jimmy knew the road ahead would be tough, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay in his path. The hunt for the truth had begun, and he would stop at nothing to uncover it. The days after Jimmy discovered Emma's betrayal felt like a blur. Every time he looked at her, a wave of anger and sadness washed over him. Yet he kept his emotions hidden, playing the role of the loving husband and father. His primary focus was Lily, who needed his attention and care. Emma, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to Jimmy's inner turmoil. She continued with her routine, smiling and laughing as if nothing was wrong. This facade only fueled Jimmy's resolve to uncover more evidence of her infidelity. One evening, as Jimmy rocked Lily to sleep, Emma received a phone call. She glanced at the caller ID, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she stepped outside to answer. Jimmy's suspicion grew. He knew he had to act fast before the situation escalated. The next morning, Jimmy decided to pay a visit to the boutique where Emma worked. He wanted to see Jake, the man who had turned his life upside down. As he approached the store, he saw Emma through the window, chatting and laughing with Jake. The sight made his blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Hey, honey," he said, stepping inside and trying to sound cheerful. "Just thought I'd drop by and see how you're doing." Emma looked surprised but quickly composed herself. "Oh, hi, Jimmy. This is Jake, my boss. Jake, this is my husband, Jimmy." Jake extended his hand with a smile. "Nice to meet you, Jimmy. Emma talks about you all the time." Jimmy shook his hand, forcing a smile. "Nice to meet you too, Jake." As they exchanged pleasantries, Jimmy observed Jake closely. He was charismatic, with a confident demeanor that explained why Emma might be drawn to him. But Jimmy couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He had to be strategic. Over the next few weeks, Jimmy continued to gather evidence, following Emma and Jake whenever he had the chance. He used his hunting skills to stay undetected, blending into the background while observing their interactions. His heart ached every time he saw them together, but he knew he had to stay strong. One evening, while Emma was in the shower, Jimmy took another shot at unlocking her phone. This time, he guessed a different password, their anniversary date. His hand shook as he entered the numbers, but the screen did not unlock. Frustrated but determined, he decided to search for other ways to gather evidence. Jimmy's opportunity came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, Emma left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to check on Lily. Jimmy seized the moment, quickly plugging her phone into his laptop and using software to bypass the lock screen. His heart pounded as he scrolled through her messages, finding a series of incriminating texts between her and Jake. The messages confirmed his worst fears. They spoke of secret meetings, intimate moments, and plans for the future. Jake was even encouraging Emma to leave Jimmy, promising her a better life with him. The betrayal cut deep, but Jimmy knew he couldn't confront her without a solid plan. That night, as Emma slept beside him, Jimmy lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't let Jake and Emma destroy his life and his family. He needed to act, but he had to be careful. One wrong move and everything could fall apart. The next day, Jimmy decided to confront Jake directly. He waited until Emma left for work, then drove to the boutique. As he entered, Jake looked up, surprised to see him. "Jimmy, what brings you here?" Jake asked, trying to sound friendly. "We need to talk," Jimmy said, his voice steady but filled with tension. Jake led him to the back office, closing the door behind them. "What's this about?" "I know about you and Emma," Jimmy said, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "I've seen the messages. I know everything." Jake's face paled, but he quickly composed himself. "Jimmy, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Save it," Jimmy snapped. "You think you can just waltz into my life and take everything from me? You're wrong." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Emma and we have feelings for each other, but we never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did," Jimmy said, his voice shaking with anger, "and you're going to pay for it." Jake looked worried, but he tried to maintain his composure. "What are you planning to do?" Jimmy leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "You'll find out soon enough." Leaving Jake with a sense of impending doom, Jimmy walked out of the boutique, his mind racing with plans for revenge. He knew he had to be careful, but he was determined to make them pay for their betrayal. As he drove home, Jimmy felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a burning desire for justice. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face whatever challenges lay in his path. The hunt for the truth had begun, and he would stop at nothing to uncover it. The tension between Jimmy and Jake simmered beneath the surface, a silent war brewing as each man plotted his next move. Jimmy had made his stance clear, warning Jake that if he continued his affair with Emma, there would be dire consequences. But Jake, confident in his charm and influence, chose to ignore the warning, believing Jimmy was bluffing. Jake's arrogance only fueled Jimmy's determination. He knew he had to be meticulous, planning his revenge with the same precision he used in hunting. This was no game. It was about protecting his family and reclaiming his honor. Days turned into weeks, and the clandestine affair between Emma and Jake showed no signs of slowing down. Jimmy watched them closely, his heart aching with each stolen glance and secret rendezvous. He could see the guilt in Emma's eyes when she looked at him, but she never suspected that he knew the truth. The betrayal was a festering wound, but Jimmy remained patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, while Emma was working late and Lily was asleep, Jimmy decided to confront Jake again. He waited outside the boutique until Jake emerged, locking up for the night. Jimmy stepped out of the shadows, startling Jake. "We need to talk," Jimmy said, his voice low and threatening. Jake sighed, rolling his eyes. "What now, Jimmy? I told you I have feelings for Emma, and she feels the same way." Jimmy's eyes narrowed. "You didn't listen to me. I warned you to stop this, but you didn't. Now you'll face the consequences." Jake laughed, a mocking sound that grated on Jimmy's nerves. "And what are you going to do, Jimmy? You're just a small-town guy with no power. You can't touch me." Jimmy's jaw tightened. "You'll see." As Jake walked away, Jimmy's mind raced with plans. He knew he couldn't confront Jake directly without risking everything, so he decided on a more subtle approach. He would make it look like an accident, a stroke of bad luck that would leave Jake out of commission for a long time. Jimmy spent the next few days preparing his plan. He scouted Jake's routine, noting his habits and the places he frequented. He paid special attention to Jake's morning jogs, which took him through a secluded part of the park. It was the perfect spot for an accident. One early morning, Jimmy arrived at the park before dawn, setting up a trap along Jake's jogging path. He rigged a loose branch to fall at the right moment, knowing that it would look like a natural mishap. The anticipation gnawed at him, but he steeled himself, knowing it was necessary. As the sun began to rise, Jimmy hid behind a tree, watching as Jake approached. The moment Jake was directly under the branch, Jimmy triggered the trap. The branch fell, striking Jake on the head and sending him sprawling to the ground. Jimmy waited, holding his breath as Jake lay unconscious, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. Satisfied that the plan had worked, Jimmy slipped away, leaving Jake to be discovered by a passerby. He returned home, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and satisfaction. He had done what he needed to do, but the gravity of his actions weighed heavily on him. Later that day, news of Jake's accident spread through town. Emma received a call from a coworker, her face turning pale as she listened. "Jake's in the hospital," she said, her voice trembling. "He had an accident during his jog." Jimmy feigned surprise. "What happened?" "They said a branch fell on him," Emma replied, tears welling up in her eyes. "He's in serious condition." Jimmy wrapped his arms around her, trying to comfort her while hiding his own sense of relief. "I'm sure he'll be okay," he said softly, though he knew the truth. The days that followed were tense. Emma visited Jake in the hospital, her guilt and worry etched on her face. Jimmy played the role of the supportive husband, taking care of Lily and managing the household. But inside, he felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Jake was out of the picture, at least for now. As the weeks passed, Jimmy kept a close eye on Emma. She was more careful, avoiding any suspicion. But Jimmy knew better. He had tasted revenge, and though it had momentarily satisfied his anger, the wound of betrayal still festered. He wondered how far he would have to go to protect his family and whether Emma would ever realize the true cost of her actions. In the meantime, Jimmy maintained his facade, pretending that everything was normal. But he knew that the peace he had fought so hard to achieve was fragile, built on a foundation of lies and secrets. The hunt for the truth was far from over, and Jimmy was prepared to do whatever it took to keep his family together. The aftermath of Jake's accident left a palpable tension in the air, but Emma remained blissfully unaware of Jimmy's knowledge and involvement. Jake's condition was serious enough to keep him bedridden for weeks, and the threat he posed to Jimmy's marriage seemed to be neutralized. Yet Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that his problems were far from over. Emma continued to visit Jake in the hospital, but her demeanor shifted. She was more guarded, more careful, and Jimmy could sense her growing paranoia. She tried to hide her anxiety, but he could see through her facade. It became a delicate dance of deception, each of them pretending to be oblivious to the other's secrets. One evening, as Emma prepared to visit Jake again, Jimmy casually asked, "How's Jake doing?" Emma paused, her back to him as she fixed her hair in the mirror. "His stable, but it's going to be a long recovery." Jimmy nodded, feigning concern. "Must be tough on you, visiting him every day. Are you okay?" Emma turned to face him, forcing a smile. "He'll manage, it's a lot to handle." Jimmy stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you." Emma's eyes softened, and for a moment, Jimmy saw a flicker of the woman he fell in love with. But the moment passed quickly, and she pulled away, mumbling something about needing to leave. As soon as she was out the door, Jimmy's mind raced. He needed to know more about her relationship with Jake, to ensure there were no loose ends that could unravel his life. He decided to pay a visit to Jake's workplace, hoping to gather information that could be useful. The next day, Jimmy took a detour from work and drove to the boutique where Jake worked. He parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, blending in with the morning crowd. The boutique was bustling, and Jimmy lingered near the entrance, watching the employees go about their day. He spotted one of Jake's co-workers, a young woman named Lisa, who seemed friendly and approachable. Taking a deep breath, he walked up to her. "Excuse me, are you Lisa?" She looked up, a bit startled. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm Jimmy, Emma's husband," he introduced himself, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to thank you for being so supportive during Jake's accident. Emma's been really stressed about it." Lisa's expression softened. "Oh, it's no problem. Jake's a great guy. We're all really worried about him." Jimmy nodded. "I know Emma's been visiting him a lot, and I just wanted to make sure she's not overwhelming you guys with her absence." Lisa shook her head. "Not at all. Jake's been out for a while, so we've been managing. But Emma's visits have really lifted his spirits. They've always been close." Jimmy's heart sank at the confirmation of their closeness. "Yeah, they've been friends for a long time," he said, forcing a smile. "Anyway, thanks for everything." As he walked away, Jimmy's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He knew he had to be careful, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's relationship with Jake went deeper than he initially thought. He decided to dig further, hoping to find something that could help him understand the full extent of their connection. Over the next few days, Jimmy discreetly followed Emma when she left for the hospital. He stayed at a distance, careful not to arouse suspicion. He watched as she spent hours by Jake's bedside, her expressions and body language betraying a depth of emotion that tore at Jimmy's heart. One evening, as Emma returned home, Jimmy confronted her with a seemingly innocent question. "How's Jake holding up?" Emma hesitated, then sighed. "He's improving, but it's slow." Jimmy nodded. "It must be hard seeing him like that." Emma's eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and resolve. "It is, but he needs me." Jimmy's suspicions were confirmed. Emma's attachment to Jake was stronger than he had realized. He knew he had to find a way to break their bond, to sever the ties that threatened his marriage. In a stroke of dark inspiration, Jimmy decided to use his hunting skills again, this time in a more psychological way. He began leaving subtle hints and clues around the house, designed to make Emma question her own sanity. He moved objects, left cryptic notes, and occasionally manipulated her phone to make it seem like she was receiving messages from an unknown source. Emma's behavior became increasingly erratic, her once confident demeanor now fraught with anxiety and confusion. She confided in Jimmy about her fears, not realizing he was the one orchestrating her torment. "I feel like I'm losing my mind," she whispered one night, tears streaming down her face. "I keep seeing things, getting strange messages." Jimmy held her, feigning concern. "It's just the stress, Emma. You've been through a lot. Maybe you should take a break from visiting Jake for a while." Emma nodded, her eyes haunted. "Maybe you're right. I need to clear my head." As Emma retreated into her own world of doubt and fear, Jimmy felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had managed to create a wedge between her and Jake, but he knew the battle was far from over. The darkness within him had been unleashed, and he was willing to go to any lengths to protect his family, even if it meant destroying everything in his path. Jake's recovery was slow, but eventually he was discharged from the hospital. Despite Jimmy's efforts to drive a wedge between them, Emma and Jake's bond rekindled as if nothing had changed. Their secret meetings resumed, and Jimmy's anger and paranoia grew with each passing day. Jimmy watched from the shadows, his frustration boiling over as he saw Emma slipping away from him. He knew he had to act decisively, but his earlier attempt to separate them had only been a temporary solution. This time he needed to ensure Jake would be out of the picture for good. One evening, while Emma was out visiting a friend, Jimmy sat alone in the dark, contemplating his next move. He had to send Jake back to the hospital, but it had to look like an accident. He knew it would be risky, but he was running out of options. Jimmy decided to stage an incident near Jake's workplace. He waited until late at night, when the streets were empty and the risk of being seen was minimal. He carefully set up a tripwire along a dark alley that Jake often used as a shortcut home. The wire was attached to a heavy object that would fall and injure Jake when triggered. The next evening, Jimmy followed Jake from a distance, watching as he made his way towards the alley. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until Jake suddenly stopped, as if sensing something was wrong. He turned around, his eyes scanning the darkness. Jimmy's heart raced. He had to act quickly. Just as Jake took a step forward, Jimmy's foot slipped on a loose piece of gravel, causing a loud noise. Jake's eyes locked onto him, and in that moment of realization, everything fell apart. The tripwire was triggered, but Jake managed to dodge the falling object. He stumbled, falling to the ground but not seriously injured. As he scrambled to his feet, his gaze met Jimmy's. The recognition in Jake's eyes was unmistakable. Panic surged through Jimmy. He couldn't let Jake reveal his identity. In a desperate move, he lunged at Jake, knocking him to the ground. Jake struggled, but Jimmy's adrenaline-fueled strength overpowered him. With a swift motion, Jimmy pulled a cloth soaked in chloroform from his pocket and pressed it against Jake's face. Jake's resistance weakened, and soon he was unconscious. Jimmy's mind raced. He couldn't leave Jake here. He had to hide him somewhere no one would find him. He remembered an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a place rarely visited by anyone. Jimmy dragged Jake's limp body to his car, constantly looking over his shoulder to ensure they weren't seen. The drive to the cabin was a blur, his mind consumed by the enormity of what he was doing. The darkness of the night enveloped them as he navigated the winding forest roads. When they finally reached the cabin, Jimmy struggled to carry Jake inside. The place was damp and musty, a relic of a bygone era. He tied Jake to an old wooden chair, ensuring he couldn't escape. As he stood back, panting from the effort, he felt a mix of relief and dread. Jimmy sat down on a dusty crate, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had just done. He had crossed a line, one that he couldn't easily come back from. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him, but he couldn't turn back now. He had to see this through for the sake of his marriage and his sanity. Hours passed and Jake began to stir. Jimmy stood over him, his expression cold and unyielding. Jake's eyes slowly opened, confusion giving way to fear as he took in his surroundings. "Why, Jimmy?" Jake croaked, his voice weak. Jimmy's jaw tightened. "You should have stayed away, Jake. I warned you." Jake's eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "You can't keep me here forever. Someone will find out." Jimmy shook his head. "No one comes out here, and even if they did, they wouldn't find you in time." The days that followed were a blur of tension and paranoia. Jimmy visited the cabin regularly, bringing food and water for Jake but keeping their interactions minimal. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Back home, Emma grew increasingly worried about Jake's sudden disappearance. She called his workplace, his friends, anyone who might have seen him. Jimmy played the concerned husband, offering his support while secretly reveling in her growing desperation. As the days turned into weeks, Jimmy's carefully constructed facade began to crack. The strain of his double life weighed heavily on him, and he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting the worst. One evening, as Emma sat at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying, she looked at Jimmy with a mixture of hope and despair. What if something terrible has happened to him? What if he's in trouble? Jimmy's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. We can't give up hope. Maybe he just needed some time away. People do strange things when they're stressed. Emma nodded, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. She leaned on Jimmy for support, not knowing that the man she trusted was the very one responsible for her anguish. As Jimmy lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized he was trapped in a web of his own making. The darkness that had consumed him was now his constant companion, and there was no easy way out. He had to continue playing his role, keeping his secrets hidden while navigating the treacherous waters of his own conscience. The next few weeks would test Jimmy's resolve like never before. The tension at home grew unbearable, and the constant fear of discovery gnawed at him. He knew that any slip-up could unravel everything, and the consequences would be devastating. In his heart, Jimmy understood that he was no longer the man he once was. The path he had chosen was one of darkness and deceit, and there was no turning back. The only way forward was to continue down this perilous road, no matter the cost. Jake had been missing for 3 days, and the tension in the air was palpable. Emma's worry turned to desperation as she called Jake's family, and together they decided to file a missing persons report. The police took their statements, and an investigation was launched immediately. The first 4 days yielded no leads, and Emma's distress grew with each passing moment. Jimmy played the role of the concerned husband, all the while feeling the weight of his secret. Despite their initial lack of progress, the police were determined to find Jake. On the 5th day, they decided to re-examine all the evidence and visit the last place Jake was seen. They meticulously combed through the area where the accident had occurred, looking for anything they might have missed. As they were about to call it a day, one of the officers found a small overlooked piece of fabric snagged on a branch near the alley. It was from Jake's shirt. The discovery reignited their investigation. The police expanded their search radius and began piecing together the sequence of events. They questioned witnesses and reviewed security footage from nearby businesses. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. Jimmy watched the unfolding investigation with a mix of anxiety and dread. He knew it was only a matter of time before they got too close. He needed to act quickly. Anticipating the police might eventually find the cabin, he moved Jake to a new location in the dead of night. As he transported Jake, who was now weak and barely conscious, Jimmy's mind raced with thoughts of how to maintain control of the situation. Once Jake was hidden away again, Jimmy returned to the old cabin. He left a note in Jake's place, written in a hurried scrawl. The note read, "I never wanted this to happen. Jake is alive but in bad shape. He is getting worse every day. I am sorry." With that done, Jimmy hoped to buy himself some time. The next morning, the police discovered the cabin during their expanded search. The sight of the abandoned, decrepit building gave them hope that they were on the right track. When they entered and found the note, it confirmed their suspicions. Jake had been there. Emma's heart broke when she heard the news. The thought of Jake suffering somewhere, getting worse each day, was unbearable. The police intensified their search, using the note as a clue to narrow down potential hiding places. They also began to question everyone more rigorously, including Jimmy. Jimmy played his part perfectly, expressing shock and concern over the note. He suggested that maybe Jake had enemies or had gotten involved with something dangerous. The police took his statement seriously but didn't rule out any possibilities. As the investigation progressed, Jimmy's paranoia grew. He knew he had to keep a close eye on the police's movements and stay one step ahead. The pressure was mounting, and he felt the walls closing in on him. He began to sleep less, his mind constantly racing with contingency plans and worst-case scenarios. One evening, while Emma was out talking to the police, Jimmy decided to visit Jake. The new location was even more remote, a rundown barn on the edge of town that no one visited anymore. When he arrived, Jake was barely conscious, his condition visibly deteriorating. Jimmy brought food and water, trying to keep him alive just long enough to figure out his next move. As Jimmy tended to Jake, a surge of guilt and anger welled up inside him. He never imagined things would go this far. He had wanted to protect his marriage, to keep his family intact, but now he was caught in a web of lies and deceit of his own making. Back at home, Emma was growing increasingly suspicious of Jimmy's behavior. His erratic actions and unexplained absences were starting to add up. She began to wonder if he knew more about Jake's disappearance than he was letting on. Emma confided her concerns to the police, who started to take a closer look at Jimmy. Jimmy sensed the shift in the investigation and knew he had to act fast. He decided to move Jake one last time, to a place where no one would ever think to look. But as he was preparing for the move, something unexpected happened. Jake woke up and recognized Jimmy. "Why are you doing this?" Jake whispered weakly. Jimmy's face hardened. "You should have stayed away from Emma." Jake's eyes widened with realization and fear. He struggled weakly against his restraints, but his strength was gone. Jimmy knew he couldn't leave Jake there. He had to disappear completely. Jimmy decided to Jake and take him to an isolated cabin deep in the woods, a place where people rarely ventured. As he dragged Jake into his car, Jimmy's mind raced with the gravity of his actions. He knew he was crossing a line from which there was no return. The drive to the cabin was a blur of darkness and tension. Jimmy's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the winding roads. When they finally arrived, he dragged Jake inside and tied him to an old chair. The cabin was damp and musty, a relic of a bygone era, and it would be Jake's prison. Jimmy stood over Jake, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He knew he had to keep Jake hidden, but the guilt and fear were becoming unbearable. As he left the cabin that night, he realized he was no longer the man he once was. The darkness had consumed him, and there was no turning back. The police continued their investigation, following every lead and clue. Emma's suspicions grew, and she began to piece together the truth. But Jimmy was always one step ahead, hiding his tracks and maintaining his facade. As the days turned into weeks, the tension at home became unbearable. Emma's desperation to find Jake and Jimmy's constant fear of discovery created an atmosphere of palpable dread. Jimmy knew that any slip-up could unravel everything, and the consequences would be devastating. In his heart, Jimmy understood that he was trapped in a web of his own making. The path he had chosen was one of darkness and deceit, and there was no turning back. The only way forward was to continue down this perilous road, no matter the cost. Leads were mounting against Jimmy, but the police still had no concrete proof. The pressure was unbearable. Jimmy's nights were sleepless, his mind plagued with fear and guilt. One night, as he lay in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, he knew he had to make a choice. He could either turn himself in or eliminate Jake for good. The next day, Jimmy went to his garage, retrieving a rifle he had kept hidden for emergencies. His hand shook as he loaded it, his mind racing with the gravity of his decision. He drove to the remote cabin where Jake lay weak and unconscious. Upon arrival, Jimmy approached Jake, who was barely conscious. He raised his rifle and fired at the wolf. As it prepared to leap from the bushes at them, the sound of the shot echoing in the night. Jimmy quickly untied Jake and lifted him into his car. The drive back was tense, but Jimmy knew what he had to do. As Jake began to stir, Jimmy explained his plan. "Jake, if you promise not to say anything, I'll let you live," Jimmy said, his voice a mix of desperation and determination. Jake, weak and fearful for his life, nodded in agreement. Jimmy continued to drive, taking a route that led them back toward the town. He made sure to stay out of sight, avoiding any main roads. When they reached the edge of the town, Jimmy pulled over and looked at Jake. "You're going to say you lost your memory. You do not remember anything. Got it?" Jake nodded again, his eyes wide with fear and understanding. Jimmy drove to a spot near where the police were still investigating. Under the cover of darkness, he quietly led Jake to a spot where he knew they would be found. Jake limped towards the investigators, clutching his head and feigning confusion. The police were alerted immediately. They rushed to Jake, asking him questions, but Jake stuck to the story Jimmy had given him. "I do not remember anything," Jake repeated over and over. I do not know what happened." Emma, hearing the news, rushed to the scene. Seeing Jake in such a state was a shock, but something had changed in her feelings. The thrill of their affair had been replaced by the stark reality of the situation. She felt nothing for him anymore except pity. Jake and Emma only saw each other at work from then on. Their interactions were brief and professional. Emma's focus shifted entirely to her family, especially after the ordeal. Jimmy and Emma decided it was best to move. The memories in their current home were too painful, and they needed a fresh start for the sake of their new baby. They found a house in a new neighborhood, far from the shadows of the past. As they settled into their new life, Jimmy reflected on everything that had happened. He knew he would carry the burden of his actions forever, but he was determined to make the best of his second chance. He focused on being a better husband and father, hoping that his dark past would never catch up with him. Emma, too, tried to move on. She poured her energy into her family and her job, leaving the past behind. The events had changed her, making her more appreciative of what she had. In their new neighborhood, Jimmy and Emma slowly built a new life. They made friends, joined community activities, and found a sense of normalcy. The memory of Jake and the chaos that had ensued faded with time, but it was never completely gone. It served as a reminder of how fragile their lives had been and how easily everything could have been lost. For Jimmy, every day was a struggle to maintain the facade of a perfect life. He knew the truth of what he had done, and the guilt lingered like a shadow. But he also knew that he had to keep moving forward, for the sake of his family and for the sake of the life he had fought so hard to protect. As the years went by, the incident with Jake became a distant memory for most. Emma and Jimmy's baby grew up in a loving home, blissfully unaware of the dark past that had once threatened to tear their family apart. Jimmy's hunting skills, once used for survival and sport, had ultimately been the tools of his darkest deeds. But now he used them to teach his child about respect for nature and the importance of integrity. He hoped that by imparting these lessons, he could somehow atone for his past. Emma found peace in her new role as a mother and wife. She no longer felt the need to seek excitement outside her marriage, having realized the true value of what she had almost lost. She worked hard to rebuild the trust and love in her relationship with Jimmy. In their new neighborhood, they were seen as the perfect family, a picture of happiness and success. Only Jimmy and Emma knew the truth, and they guarded their secret closely, determined to protect their child from the dark realities of their past. As Jimmy lay in bed one night, he looked over at Emma and their child, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew he could never fully escape his past, but he was determined to create a better future for his family. In the end, Jimmy and Emma's story was one of redemption and the strength of the human spirit. They had faced their darkest moments and emerged stronger, committed to building a life of love, trust, and honesty. And though the shadows of their past would always linger, they had found a way to move forward, together.